Hello, welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Young-Kyo Kim. U.S. President Joe Biden made his first South Korea visit of his presidency. While North Korea was on the agenda of the summit meeting between President Biden and South Korea's new president Yoon Suk-yeol, what was highlighted was reshaping and leveling up the existing alliance to a more global alliance. Today, we'll discuss these and more. In the studio with me is Gary Seymore, professor of the practice of politics at Brandeis University. Dr. Seymore served in the U.S. government for over 20 years. He was a White House coordinator for arms control and weapons of mass destruction. Also joining me is Anthony Ruggiero, senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracy. Mr. Ruggiero served as deputy assistant to the president for national security affairs and National Security Council senior director for counterproliferation and biodefense. Thank you so much for your time today. Really good to see you in the studio.
Thank you.
President Biden had the first face-to-face dialogue with President Yoon. And by the time this show is being aired, the two leaders, of course, have had discussed the challenges coming from North Korea. But overall, it seemed like they were trying to draw a bigger picture of the alliance. Dr. Samore, what do you think the two leaders were trying to achieve out of this summit?
So I think both Biden and Yoon share an interest in confirming the traditional US-ROK security alliance, which is primarily focused on North Korea. But both of them want to shift the alliance toward a more global focus. And global means two things. One, it means South Korea playing a greater role on global issues like climate change or public health. But global is also a code word for integrating South Korea more into US efforts in Asia to counter Chinese influence. And that includes improving ROK-Japanese relations. I think that will be the main political challenge for President Yoon.
Mr. Ruggiero, your thought?
Well, I agree. I think President Yoon is trying to make South Korea a global player, consistent with its top 10 economy. But unfortunately for him, I think local issues will dominate his presidency. You mentioned North Korea. China is another. The feud with Japan, hopefully that can be resolved or at least go a long way toward that during Biden's visit.
So traditionally, U.S. and ROK alliance was more focused on North Korea, and now they're preparing to go beyond that. Is that right?
Well, I think that's right. I think South Korea wants to go, the new administration wants to go beyond. The real question here is, can he do that if there are issues at home that are more pressing? And I think that's going to turn out to be the case, at least in the first year of his presidency.
And Dr. Samore, South Korea's Yoon administration has said it is aiming to build a comprehensive and strategic alliance. And this word, comprehensive and strategic alliance, this is not new, is it?
No, it's been used before, and I think the U.S. would welcome South Korea getting involved in issues more than just the security alliance against North Korea. So comprehensive means technological, and again, that deals a lot with supply chain security and dealing with reliance on China, as well as economic issues. So I think the Biden administration understands that its approach to Asia can't be limited to security issues. U.S. has a lot of military power, but to deal with China, they have to deal with technological challenges and with economic challenges because China is such an important economic player. So the U.S. approach towards South Korea is a reflection of a broader U.S. approach toward Asia that will try to build on the security alliances and add a technological and economic dimension.
And there were a lot of emphasis on the technology and the supply chains too. President Biden kicked off his 3-day visit to South Korea with a tour of Samsung Electronics semiconductor fabrication site. There, President Biden said it is critical for the U.S. to work with close partners who do share the U.S. values, such as South Korea, to secure more of what the U.S. needs from the allies and bolster the supply chain resilience. And President Yoon said he looks forward to the U.S.-South Korea partnership blossoming into an economic and security alliance. Mr. Ruggiero, why is the cooperation in the technology and the supply chains important at this moment?
Well, I think there's two factors. There's the factor that we all dealt with the shortage of semiconductor chips, but then there's the more advanced chips that we're trying to make sure the U.S. and I assume South Korea and definitely Japan are trying to keep from China certain Chinese companies. And so that's what two of the reasons. The other is a domestic reason. Certainly, a lot of these chip manufacturers have plants here in the United States, which means American jobs. I get back to the point I made about the South Korea-Japan relationship. Those two countries, with the U.S. and with some other suppliers in Europe, need to work together on this issue. That's another reason why I think Biden's working on that relationship.
Dr. Samore, is this stressing about technology and stressing about the supply chain, is this also about containing China's growing prowess?
I think that's the primary motivation. But of course, everybody wants to be polite. So instead of saying we're doing this in order to limit China, they're talking about supply chain assurances, which is a polite way of saying reduce dependence on China. And Biden's argument is that U.S. allies in Asia and around the world can't depend on China because it's an autocratic system. It has expressed hostile intention toward Taiwan and been aggressive militarily in the South China Sea. So the argument Biden is making is that to protect ourselves from China using its technological advantages for political ends, we have to develop alternative supply for items like semiconductor chips and so forth.
So earlier you said that the United States is beginning to think that only security alliance is not enough for U.S. relationship with the Indo-Pacific allies. Is because China's economic dominance in the region, and that is really rubbing off. I mean, it's moving on to the power in the politics arena. Is that right?
I think that's exactly right. I mean, the two big enemies or possible enemies the U.S. worries about is Russia and China. The Russia threat is primarily a military threat, and Biden has demonstrated strong leadership in rallying NATO against the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Russia doesn't really pose much of an economic threat except for its supply of raw materials like oil and gas. The Chinese threat is much more complicated and much more serious because China has a large economy, advanced investment in infrastructure and research and development. So the U.S. recognizes that a security-only approach will not be sufficient to deal with the Chinese challenge and that it has to be broader.
Mr. Ruggiero, this concern was also, there was also similar concern during the Trump administration, right?
Yeah, that's really where this started, and it's one of the policies that the Biden administration has moved forward. They've continued it. They've moved forward. I guess I'm less. I'm more direct. That a lot of this is directed at China, and for good reason. Their use of some of these in the Uyghur situation and other areas. But South Korea can be an important partner here. The question will be whether South Korea has a response when China uses their economic coercion as they did when South Korea took the THAAD system, the anti-missile system from the United States.
And the Yoon administration made it public its willingness to participate as a founding member of the U.S. proposed Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which is also called IPEF. Dr. Samore, why do you think South Korea is willing to join despite the fact China is criticizing?
So I think South Korea, like all of the Asian countries, have big economic stakes in their relationship both with China and the US. So none of the Asian countries are willing to exclusively align themselves economically with China or the US. So South Korea has joined the free trade agreement that China supports, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, and most of the other Asian countries have joined as well, Japan, Australia, the ASEAN countries. Now I think most of the Asian countries will join this American-sponsored framework, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. And I think the message here is that the Asian countries are not going to be in one camp when it comes to economics because they have such strong interests in continuing economic relations with both Beijing and Washington.
Do you see any potential problem with the framework? I mean, will China stay still and just watch it?
Well, it's hard to tell because we don't know a lot of details. I think a lot of these allies in the region are looking for the answers that, like Gary mentioned. I think the other questions that they're asking are, what are the details? They'd like to hear Biden talk about his view of the U.S.-China relationship. It's very, very complicated, whether it's working together on climate change with China and maybe even North Korea, and then what we talked about before, the semiconductor issue and other potential issues. I think they're interested in what the details are going to be on this framework.
And the Biden administration reaffirmed the U.S. defense commitments at the summit. And even before the summit took place, South Korea said an action plan for how South Korea and the United States will strengthen the reliable and effective extended deterrence will be discussed. Mr. Ruggiero, what could be the reliable and effective extended deterrence?
Right. I think they have talked about military exercises. That's something that certainly the previous administration should not have changed the approach on military exercises. I think we should go back to what we've done before, especially since many of those troops do a very short, at least on the U.S. side, a very short time period there. They could do more military exercises. I think this is, going back to the war in Ukraine. This is a critical question for the South Korea and Japan, where you have a nuclear state that invaded a non-nuclear state and has threatened to use nuclear weapons. So the question is, how is the U.S. going to both deter Russia and then, if Russia uses them, respond in that way?
Dr. Samore, do you think this could also mean the additional deployment of the U.S. military assets around the Korean Peninsula?
I think that's been discussed. The U.S. and the ROK are looking for ways to demonstrate that U.S. extended deterrence is credible. And one possible way to do that is to increase visits or deployment of U.S. strategic assets like submarines and long-range bombers. I think there'll be a discussion about nuclear sharing, which would involve the redeployment either temporarily or permanently of U.S. nuclear forces on the Korean Peninsula. But I don't think either Washington or Seoul are prepared to take that step yet. I think it would be very controversial. But for the time being, I think the U.S. and the ROK are going to be looking at ways to symbolically demonstrate, mainly to the South Korean public, because I think the North Koreans probably already know it, that the U.S. is committed to defend South Korea, including, if necessary, using nuclear forces.
The Yoon administration has a very keen interest in South Korea joining Quad. Do you think that could help in security-wise?
Well, I think it really a lot depends on South Korea's relationship with China. I mean, the reason why South Korea has been reluctant to openly join the Quad, which is much more of a military-focused organization, and that means much more of a threat from China's standpoint, is because South Korea is counting on China to help control and contain North Korea. If China demonstrates that it's using its influence to prevent North Korean provocations, to nudge North Korea back to the negotiating table, then I think South Korea will be more reluctant to do things that would offend China. But if China is either unwilling or unable to affect North Korean behavior, if Kim Jong-un continues to conduct tests and continues to refuse to negotiate, then I think there's less constraint on South Korea moving towards some cooperation with the Quad. Maybe not joining fully, but participating in some of the Quad activities like anti-piracy exercises and so forth.
Mr. Ruggiero, will South Korea's joining Quad will help its defense as well?
Well, it could. I think the question for the new administration in South Korea is, are they prepared for China's response to that? Because we know when we had the THAAD deployment that the Chinese used their economic coercion against South Korea. They've used it in some of the other countries in the Quad. So I think for the new administration, they'd probably work backwards. They made the decision, China responds, and then the United States will play a role in that, and other countries in the Quad in helping South Korea respond. But I think Gary's right. The other I would mention is, the public health initiatives they've been doing amongst the Quad because of the pandemic. That is certainly something South Korea could work on without being a full member just to start with.
The trilateral relationship among the US, South Korea, and Japan has been also reiterated. And President Yoon, unlike his predecessor, has repeatedly brought up the need to restore South Korea's relationship with Japan. Mr. Ruggiero, do you think this will be possible?
Well, they're both saying the right thing on the Japan and the South Korea side, and the South Korea side has the advantage of being new, and they can sort of decide to move on. But I think, as everyone at this table knows, that everyone says the right thing initially, does the right thing initially, and then something happens where the relationship gets off the rails. This is really where the U.S. can help. I know it's a bilateral issue between the two countries, but the U.S. can make the point, a lot of the points we're making here today, that this is more important than just the bilateral relationship. It's the focus on China, the focus on being global players in the international community. So hopefully that will trump. But if history is any guide, it'll probably end up in the same place it was before.
Dr. Samore, really, it's
well, I
difficult.
agree with that. I mean, I think both Yoon as well as Kishida want to improve Korean-Japanese relations, but they're both dealing with a very heavy burden of public opinion, which is distrustful and hostile toward each other. So there's a real limit to how far they can move their countries. The U.S. obviously has to play a very active role, and the U.S. argument will be, in order to deal with the challenge from China, the ROK and Japan have to work together. And Biden will hopefully try to build on his success in the case of Europe, responding to the European challenge. He'll try to use those same arguments to argue for solidarity in Asia against the China challenge.
So overall, when we look at Biden's visit to South Korea as well as to Japan, it is very focused on containing China's ambitions. And Dr. Samore, what kind of message did this trip give to China?
Well, this is speculation, but I think the Chinese must be uncomfortable and discouraged by the way Ukraine has turned out. I mean, their ally has suffered a very significant strategic defeat. The U.S. has been able to rally its NATO allies for a very strong response, sanctions and military support. So to the extent that China benefits from weak American leadership, and division among American allies, Ukraine has produced exactly the opposite. So I would think the Chinese would want to be careful about not acting in a way that would make it easier for the U.S. to rally allied solidarity in Asia. And that would argue for China's response being relatively low-key and cautious as opposed to hostile. Furthermore, Xi Jinping is focused on his domestic politics. He wants to get his third term confirmed this fall. So if that logic makes sense, then China's response will be very careful and cautious. But as Tony pointed out, in the past, China has responded in a very heavy-handed way against South Korea. And I think that'll be an interesting test to see whether Beijing recognizes the risks that the U.S. and its allies pose.
Mr. Ruggiero, how will this be received by China?
Well, I think Gary's right, but also China knows that being there is everything, right? Biden could have invited these leaders to the White House. He could have said, I'm dealing with a war in Europe and I'm expanding NATO, helping expand NATO. I just can't travel to Asia right now. Not only is he going to Asia, he's doing the second in-person meeting for the Quad. I think if you asked China when this administration began, they probably hoped that there were more people in the Biden administration that would go back to the President Trump days. But that has changed. I mean, the American domestic opinion, both senators and congressmen and on both sides of the aisle have changed their view of China policy. And I think China is still catching up. So I think, China is going to be very, cautious on what Biden says, especially if Biden does articulate how he sees the U.S.-China relationship.
Mm-hmm. And we also have to talk about North Korea. Apparently, the COVID outbreak is not stopping North Korea from advancing its nuclear and ballistic missile programs. And during his visit to South Korea, President Biden is visiting the Korean Air and Space Operations Center instead of a demilitarized zone, as the two leaders are seeking to reinforce the allies' security posture. Mr. Ruggiero, what is your thought about President Biden not visiting DMZ and instead going to this Air Force Center?
Well, it sounds like President Biden is gonna have an opportunity to go to a base and talk to South Korean and U.S. troops. That's important. He's been to the DMZ many times before. The others in his administration have gone, will go. I don't think it's a necessary stop on the tour. What North Korea does is always a big question. I just want to highlight, what you said in the opening, that the Kim family, instead of thinking about the North Korean people, building North Korea's healthcare system to address this kind of pandemic, is building ballistic missiles and nuclear weapons. Mm-hmm. That just tells you everything that I think people need to know about the Kim family and their priorities.
What kind of message Biden's visit is sending to North Korea?
Well, the first message is to try to deter North Korea. And I think the U.S. and the ROK have been extremely successful in sending that message since the end of the Korean War. And if anything, the military balance is even more favorable for South Korea now, except for North Korea's missile and nuclear development. The conventional forces are very much in South Korea's advantage. Mm-hmm. The second message is that the U.S. and the new South Korean government are ready to resume diplomacy, North-South talks and U.S. DPRK denuclearization talks. But unfortunately, I don't see much evidence that Kim Jong-un is interested in the near term. Uh-huh. I think he's likely to continue to carry out a series of tests, but at some point, he'll return to the bargaining table and see what kind of economic benefits and sanctions relief he can get in exchange for limited nuclear steps. We've seen that movie many times. We know how that plays out. And whatever limits we're able to achieve are not likely to be very significant or very long-lasting.
As my last question, I was going to ask, how will North Korea respond? So you obviously responded, right? So how is North Korea, what is North Korea going to do after this summit?
Well, I think in North Korea, is the COVID pandemic notwithstanding, Kim likes the status quo. There's no reason for him to change. He can test missiles. He can test a nuclear weapon if he wants. He knows there's not going to be a Security Council resolution. And Biden's sanctions have been infrequent and frankly inadequate to address the threat. Even if we don't believe that we're going to achieve denuclearization in the medium term, we need sanctions implementation to ensure they don't get the money for those programs and they don't get the inputs for those programs. That essentially dropped off in 2019, starting the previous administration. We need to build that back. It's a bipartisan issue here in the United States. We should be fixing that. Hopefully we do. Maybe that'll be the unintended consequence of North Korea doing a nuclear test.
All of the three countries, the US, South Korea, and Japan, agree in principle that the restoration of the South Korean and Japan relationship is vital for the US to fully implement its Indo-Pacific strategy. However, how this will be executed by both South Korea and Japan sides remain to be seen. Dr. Samore and Mr. Ruggiero, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And that does it for this week's Washington Talk from Voice of America. Please join us again next week for more analysis.